Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for coming for the interdisciplinary speaker series on the ethics of argumentation. Today, it's our great pleasure and great honor to have Dr. Ian Kidd speak to us. Dr. Kidd is an associate professor of philosophy at the University of Nottingham, and he researches social epistemology, the philosophy of illness and healthcare, and South and East Asian philosophies. And today he's going to speak to us about whatever happened to misology. Is that right? Misology or is it misology? You will correct me. Thank you so much for being here. Please take it away.
Okay, well, thank you to Kat for the very kind introduction and the invitation to be here. I'm only an occasional dabbling amateur in argumentation theory, actually partly inspired by several of the folks in this room. So it's a pleasure to be here. I think Kat can circulate a copy of the handout if you'd like a copy of the notes and references, or if you just want to look at something that's not me. So the topic is misology, and the question is, whatever happened to misology? I'll explain in a moment what misology is. The background interest I have in this is I'm currently writing a book defending a form of misanthropy, not hatred of human beings. There's enough of that in the world. Rather, misanthropy understood as a negative moral verdict on humankind, a negative judgment of our moral condition. And the first philosophical discussion of misanthropy is in Socrates' dialogue, Phaedo, where he also discusses misology. And that was my way into thinking about misology. And when I started to look at it, as it were, for its own sake, it seemed to me that this is a concept which seems strangely underused in a lot of contemporary philosophy. It seems to me that we live in quite a misological world, and that it's therefore strange that the concept doesn't play more of a role. I mean, the academic literature on misology is tiny. As far as I can tell, it's not really used in social or political epistemology, which are the areas I know best. And it doesn't really seem to be one of those terms which has much popular currency. And so my question is partly, well, why did the concept never take off? But the prior question is, well, what is misology exactly? I mean, one of the reasons it's very difficult to articulate is that little word logos. Of course, in Greek, that's an extremely versatile term. Logos can refer to reason, argument, specific arguments, reason, discourse, accounts or stories of things which might not have any rational component. So the term itself is quite difficult to define. I mean, in its narrow sense, the one that seems to be dominant in most of what I've read, misology is defined as a hatred or distrust of reason and argument. Misologists are reason haters. They are people who are opposed to rational discourse, rational argumentation. But in a slightly broader sense, I think misology refers to quite a wide range of negative attitudes towards argumentation, reason, reasonable discourse, and behind this, a sort of global collapse of epistemic confidence in our ability to use reasoned argumentation and discourse to resolve life's problems. And this is sometimes emphasized in the literature on Socrates' discussion. So Miller, in what I think is the best paper, or one of the best papers on misology, says, we have to understand that misology is a psychological crisis. It is no mere state of aporia. It is the prospect of losing the ability to feel conviction about any opinion at all. And it's that kind of richer sense of misology that I want to move us towards. I mean, the specific examples might include a hatred or distrust of reason or the use of reason in human life. But I think behind it, there is a much more complex kind of epistemic predicament. And I think that we can use misology to think about what this predicament is. It's also useful to make a distinction between having misological attitudes, convictions, and feelings and being a misologue. I take it that lots of people, at least on certain occasions, might feel kinds of frustration or dislike with reason discourse. For example, cases where reason fails us in a certain situation. But that's quite different from being a misologue in the sense of someone who has a hardened hostility towards or a distrust of reason. I mean, the analogy here is with actually with misanthropy. So in a very nice recent paper, Kate Norlock says, there is surely a difference between having misanthropic thoughts and feelings, which most of us might have, and being a misanthrope. I mean, lots of people can have misanthropic thoughts and feelings, maybe on a daily basis. But what makes you a misanthrope is that these thoughts and feelings become central to your identity, your outlook, and your orientation towards the world. And likewise, I want to suggest that maybe lots of people will have occasional misological feelings and convictions, but that's not the same as being a misologue. And I think Socrates' concern is, what do we do when people who have misological feelings start to become misologues in the full-blooded sense? When people become tempted to misology, how can we, as it were, reach out to them and pull them back and restore and renew their commitment to and their trust in reason? And here we might also think about misology in a broader sense. So there are a couple of books in what we might call philosophical cultural critique, who complain that we are living in a world which has misological tendencies and habits. So, for example, Schindler, who's writing a sort of philosophical critique of the world, says there was a certain kind of mistrust or contempt for reason, but it used to be confined to isolated thinkers. And he mentioned Rousseau. But over time, it's attained to something like the root of modern cultural life. And the worry here is that maybe misology at a certain point in history was confined to certain kinds of philosophers, maybe small individual groups. But now misology and misological thinking has sort of gone viral. And the product of this is the sort of world which some people would describe as irrationalistic, a world overcome with fanaticism, populism, extremism. And some people then do use the term misology in that sense of a broad cultural critique. And of course, those sorts of claims are always quite easy to make, but very difficult to cash out. There's a lot of historical and sociological work you would need to do in order to characterize contemporary misology. But maybe there is something to the sense that there are misological tendencies and powers within the world that might call out for our attention. And maybe using the concept of misology as a way of diagnosing those problems. And this is something that I see in a lot of contemporary virtue, vice, and social epistemology. I think the concept of misology would do work in those disciplines, but if it's going to do that work, we need to have a better sense of what misology is. And so what I'll do, I'll start off with what I'm going to call the standard model of misology, which is the one informed and inspired by Socrates' discussion. It doesn't seem to persuade any of the scholars, the standard account, and I'm going to raise two problems. One concerns the idea of a loss of trust in reason, and the other concerns Socrates' insistence that misology always reflects something wrong with the misologist. He has a pathological account of misology. If you're misological and if you become tempted by misology, there is something wrong with you. It's a reflection of defects. And I think that is an exaggeration. I think what we need is a more social and interpersonal account of misology. And that's what I'm going to move us towards at the very end of the talk. But I'll start with the standard account. So this is section 2 on the handout. So misology is discussed in at least 3 places in the Socratic dialogues. The main discussion is in Phaedo. It's also discussed very briefly in the Republic and also in the Laches. The way Socrates uses the term, it doesn't seem to be original to him. So when he mentions it in the dialogue, everyone immediately knows what he means. So there must have been at least some misologues or proto-misologues out there. So he's not innovating the term, but his is the first recorded philosophical use of it, at least within the Western tradition. I mean, parenthetically, I think there are varieties of misology in other traditions, but I'm just going to talk here about Socrates. And the discussion of misology becomes exactly halfway through the dialogue. So if you know the dialogue, Phaedo, the context is a discussion amongst Socrates, Phaedo, and others about the immortality of the soul. And in the first half, Socrates, in his usual way, has taken us through 4 arguments for and against the immortality of the soul. Each argument has met with approval, then it's been knocked down. And at this point in the dialogue, suddenly there's a kind of change in the mood amongst most of the interlocutors. And they suddenly become extremely anxious about the prospects for the discussion. They say you offered these 4 arguments. Individually, we thought each one was very good, and then you knocked it down. And then they start to despair, not just about the prospects of proving the immortality of the soul. They start to despair about the prospects of proving anything ever in any context. And there's a highly generalized epistemic anxiety. And they report an unpleasant feeling, disorientation, uncertainty, as if the ground is being lost beneath them. And Socrates immediately recognizes this and regards it as a serious enough situation that it needs to make an intervention. I mean, he says to them, like, I've emphasized the limitations on reason. I've tried to encourage a properly humble understanding of what reason and argumentation can do, and yet you fall into despair. And Socrates, in fact, does this very dramatically. He announces that misology is the greatest evil that can befall a person. So he really lays it on quite thick. He doesn't quite explain why it's the greatest evil. I mean, the scholars also disagree. So for some, misology is evil because it will fundamentally undermine your epistemic self-trust, and therefore it will deflect you from reality. It will undermine your general epistemic competencies. For other scholars, misology is a triumph of desire over reason, because it's clear that a lot of Socrates' interlocutors, they really, really want to believe in the immortality of the soul. It has a deep emotional and existential significance, and they're frustrated that reason cannot confirm this belief that they want to hold to so strongly. And so one worry is that what they're really doing is choosing to believe something despite having no rational support, and they elevate their beliefs over what reason can supply. But there's no real agreement on why it is that Misology is the greatest evil, and Socrates doesn't really make it very, very clear. But it is clear that he regards Misology as an urgent and acute threat in that situation, one so strong that he immediately needs to intervene. Although his intervention is very strange. He just warns them, don't become misological. If you give in to these temptations, if you succumb to these feelings, it's going to lead you into an evil place. But he doesn't offer an argument against Misology, and he doesn't, for example, demonstrate the power of reason. Instead, he just issues a strong warning. Don't go down this path. And I think then that we can offer the following reconstruction of Misology. It's complicated, and it has 7 parts, and it involves what Socrates perceives as a transition from a sort of pre-misological phase to a fully misological phase. And I think he sees some of his interlocutors as having initiated a process that, unless it's checked, will lead them into full-blooded misology. And it begins with an initial excessive trust in reason, an exaggerated, inflated trust in reason, one that goes far in excess of anything that a more reasonable person would actually warrant. And this excessive trust in reason brings with it certain excessive expectations about what reason can do. Because their image of reason is so inflated, they have an exaggerated sense of, for example, the range of topics on which they could achieve certainty, the speed with which reason will deliver certain kinds of confidence. And this exaggerated expectation, Socrates says, is due to failures of art. Says the misologist lacks a certain kind of art of reasoning. They don't know how to form trust in reason. They don't know how to regulate their trust in this thing called reason. Now, unfortunately, he doesn't tell us what the art of reason is. He says they lack it and it's a terrible thing, but at no point does he say what this art of reasoning is. But he says something has gone wrong at this stage. You have an excessive, inflated understanding of the nature, scope, and power of reason. And for Socrates, actually, this is also what's wrong with misanthropy. So Socrates thinks that misanthropy starts with an excessive moral trust in human beings, thinking that everyone is very, very good, everyone is kind, everyone is generous. The saints are very many and the villains are very few. And then the misanthrope has this inflated moral trust, which is doomed to be disappointed once you step out into the world and realize that it's full of villains. So at the pre-misological stage, a person has an exaggerated trust in reason. And the problem is, as Socrates says, if you then go out into the world and try to use reason, you are inevitably going to be disappointed. So at the increasingly misological stage, a person has gone out into the world, engaging in reason, discourse, offering theories and accounts and trying to engage in intelligent dialogue, and they are inevitably disappointed. They very quickly realize that reason is not all that they thought it was. They encounter limitations to the power of reason. And this is going to be disturbing, disappointing. It might entail shame if a person experiences this frustration in public. And Socrates says the disappointments in reason will be all the more acute when what you're reasoning about has moral and existential significance. For example, the immortality of the soul. This isn't a matter of casual epistemic curiosity. This is a topic that has deep significance for a person. It goes to the heart of who they are. And so when reason fails you in a context where it really, really matters that it succeeds, then you're going to be very, very vulnerable to these psychological crises. And so at this point then, misology has really started to set in. You're now experiencing frustration, disappointment, anxiety, a whole structure of negative epistemic emotions, which are well described in the dialogue. An unpleasant feeling, uncertainty, anxiety, not knowing which way to go, acute aporia, epistemic anxiety, worrying about whether reason has any power at all, whether one was deluded all along. Have I been tricked? Have I been deceived? Is the world even intelligible? And suddenly a crisis is unfolding. And at this stage, says Socrates, the person is going to tip into total misology. He says they will recoil into an excessive distrust. And this, for Socrates, is the horrible process of misological conversion. It begins with an excessive trust in reason, and the eventual end result, with lots of pain and struggle and anxiety, is an excessive distrust in reason, which will then modulate into hatred. So the process he described is very, very complicated and is a transition from a pre-misological stage to a misological one. But even from that description, as I'm sure you've gathered, there's actually a lot wrong with this. I mean, Socrates seems to see this as just what happens when a person is tempted by misology. But of course, there's lots wrong with his account. I mean, there are various non sequiturs. There are important unclarities in his argument, like not telling us what the art of reasoning is. It's puzzling why he doesn't give a defense of reason in the face of misology. He just says, don't go there, which is not very great advice to people who are already tempted to go there. The dangers of misology might depend upon the extent to which people value reason. For example, one response to misology is to just downgrade your sense of the status of reason in human life, which he doesn't consider. There's also a subtler worry about whether misology is a problem for all human beings, qua rational agents, or whether it's only going to be a problem for human beings, maybe philosophers, who have made reason and argumentation central to their identity and their vocational sense of who they are. So much later on, Boethius, in Consolations of Philosophy, also discusses misology, but he said it's only really a problem for that small, unusual group of people who make reason, discourse, and philosophizing central to who they are. Misology is not really a problem for the rest of the folks. So there's lots of scholarly discontent about Socrates' standard account, and I'm sympathetic to most of those worries. There are a lot of details to fit in to actually elaborate what Socrates is saying. And fair enough, it's not the main topic of the dialogue. It really is an interlude in the discussion, but it's an interesting one. But I want to suggest that there are actually two deeper problems with Socrates' account of the etiology of misology that are worth going into, because they might point us towards a more complex account of what misology is. And the first criticism concerns the idea of a loss of trust in reason, and the second one concerns this pathological construction of misology. So this is section 3 on the handout, criticizing the standard account. So on the way Socrates tells the story, a person becomes misological when they undergo this movement from excessive trust in reason and argument to excessive distrust. And he seems to regard this as an inevitable, almost ineluctable process. Once that process starts, the end result is going to be extreme distrust and hatred of reason. But as you're probably thinking, there's lots wrong with that. I mean, for one thing, hatred and distrust are not the same thing. You can distrust something or someone without hating them, and the one does not necessarily lead to the other. But the more important problem is that this movement to extreme distrust is only one of many possible ways of responding to a misological experience. If you suffer a disruption to your trust in reason and argument, there are many ways, as it were, that the process could go. And that process will be very conditional on all sorts of different factors, and it's going to be very complicated. I mean, some scholars do say that once a process starts, it's just going to ineluctably continue. But that clearly seems false. And one of the reasons it's false is that trust in argumentation and reason, whatever that is not going to be a single stable achievement. It's not going to be one thing that you have, and then once it's disrupted, it will just start to crumble into dust. We should really think about trust in argument and reason as a much more complex process, a whole series of interconnected and dynamically related kinds of trust with different kinds of objects, trust to different degrees, and where this structure of trust is elaborate, complex, and to a certain degree fragile. So if you think about trust in reason and argument of the sort that Socrates is describing, it probably consists of a whole variety of different kinds of trust. I mean, we might distinguish, for example, a general epistemic trust in the intelligibility of the world. So at one point in the dialogue, people worry, maybe the world itself is irrational. Maybe there are no accounts of the world that the world itself supplies. And they have a general anxiety that the world itself is unintelligible. So there could be a general trust in the intelligibility of the world itself, something utterly foundational to inquiry. But then there could also be a more general epistemic trust in reason and argumentation itself, something that might not have very much specific content, but forms a certain kind of background against which more specific trust can form. A person might also have certain kinds of agential self-trust. You might trust your own rational argumentative abilities, your abilities to develop logoi and to assess them, theorize them, critically reflect upon them. You might have trust in specific kinds of arguments. Maybe an argument that someone's given you that has withstood scrutiny. You might say, well, I trust that argument. It's always stood up to critical testing in conferences and so on. I mean, I think this is what people do at workshops. Like, I've developed an argument and I'm bringing it to you folks for stress testing. Does the argument work? And if it does, you might have a trust in it. I take it that trust in a specific argument is distinct from trust in argumentation itself as a kind of practice. Or you might have a specific trust in a certain argumentative process. So maybe you're engaging in an argument with someone and you're both being fair-minded and reasonable, and you know how to conduct yourself in an argument, and you're trusting the process itself. Maybe you're thinking, well, this is a good argument. This is going well. We're really chewing the fat here. We're really going through it. There's really great philosophical conversations that you would sort of live for, where the conversation or the discussion is fast flowing, moving, energetic. There are a few jokes here and there. You've got a decent beer as well. And you're trusting in this process, like whatever conclusions we've come to, this process is going well and I trust it. And then contrast that with cases of bad argumentation. Maybe the person's not paying attention, they're using dodgy moves, they're throwing out fallacies. You think this is just not a process to trust. So you might trust processes of argumentation, or of course, you might trust certain specific interlocutors. I mean, part of your trust in reason and argument will be an interpersonal trust in other people as arguers, people engage in argumentation. You might trust them, even if you don't quite trust a certain kind of argumentation in general. And I take it that a lot of these points are implicit in a lot of the work in virtue argumentation theory. For example, think about interpersonal trust in argumentation. You might trust someone because, for example, they occupy certain argumentative roles very well. They understand the role. They know how to comport themselves according to its standards. They recognize the role that they've been assigned in an argumentation, and they have that agile ability to shift roles as and when necessary in responding to a developing dialectic. Or maybe you trust a certain interlocutor because you recognize that they have various argumentative virtues. They're fair-minded, they're patient, they're thorough, they're diligent, they're playing certain roles very well, they're thoughtful, and you see that they have all the argumentative virtues, actually, that Andrew described in that exhaustive kind of biblical kind of listing of all the intellectual virtues of argumentation. So there's going to be a complex phenomena of trust in reason, which is highly complex and involves different kinds of trust interrelating, reinforcing one another. But that also means, as a corollary, that loss of trust in reason and argumentation can't be a unitary phenomena. When a person speaks of losing trust in argumentation, that could mean any number of things. For example, you could lose certain kinds of trust whilst retaining others. The loss of one kind of trust might have no implications for another. Or it might be that certain kinds of trust are stacked together, such that breaking one kind of trust will collapse the whole series. So loss of trust is quite consistent with the retention of other kinds of trust. I mean, here, think about the phenomena that Socrates uses to illustrate misology, so losing trust in reason. Now, if you start to lose trust in reason, there are many possible outcomes. For example, you might end up distrusting reason, or you might continue to have trust in reason, just as it were, less of it. You might not lose the trust, but the trust diminishes. It becomes qualitatively and quantitatively lesser. Or you might only lose certain kinds of trust in reason, but you retain other kinds of trust. Again, this will be familiar from interpersonal life. And if you speak of losing trust in someone, that might mean that you lose any and all trust in them. Or it might mean that you no longer trust them for certain kinds of practical or moral tasks. So there are many kinds of trust that you can have in something, and therefore many kinds of trust that you could lose. But if you lose one kind of trust, it doesn't necessarily mean that you lose all the other kinds. Or it might be the case, more optimistically, that you lose trust in something, but then you later restore it or repair it. Again, this is very familiar for interpersonal life. Suppose you have a big falling out with a colleague and there's now an atmosphere of distrust. Well, that doesn't mean that you're doomed to spend the rest of your career having awkward, distrustful conversations. We can do things about this. We can have conversations. You can have a mediated discussion. We can often try to rebuild trust, at least if the other person is very, very willing. Or, of course, you could have a sense of disruption to trust where you don't lose your trust in someone or something, but now the trust is experienced as fragile or conditional. It's not as easy and automatic as it was before. You're now aware that you're trusting them. There might be kinds of self-conscious monitoring. So loss of trust in argument and reason is surely going to be an extremely complex phenomena, far more complex than Socrates seems to think. And that one problem with the standard model then is that it doesn't really accommodate the contingency and the open-endedness of misological experiences. If your trust in reason is disrupted or damaged or lost, that doesn't put you on a single path towards extreme distrust. It opens up a range of different possibilities. And the ways that your misological experience will develop will depend upon a whole range of different factors, including, for example, the responses of people around you. So in the dialogue, when people start to get misological and anxious, Socrates responds in a particular way. He warns them, he exhorts them, he tries to encourage them. And there are lots of other things that he could do to try to stop or arrest the process. He could end the discussion. He could try to reassure them. He could offer a defensive reason. He could move the topic onto something else where they reason about something else and he builds up their confidence and then comes back. The point will be that loss of trust in reason is not a process which, once initiated, develops in an inevitable way. It is a complex, open-ended process, and the way it develops will depend a lot upon the responses and the reactions of other people. So that's my first worry about the standard account. Its account of trust in reason and loss of trust in reason is far too simplistic and far too dogmatic. Second worry, this is section 4. This second worry concerns Socrates' characterization of the process of becoming misological. And for him, it's very important to emphasize that if you're tempted by misology and if you become misological, it reflects something wrong with you in a very deep sense. So he has a pathological model of the etiology of misology. If and when a person becomes misological, it indicates something that's wrong with them. There is some moral or epistemic pathology that's at work, which explains why you are vulnerable or susceptible to misology. Almost like a person having a weak immune system. If you become infected by misology, that must reflect something bad about you. Maybe you have some kind of weak epistemic immune system. Maybe you don't have a certain kind of robust strength of character. In fact, Socrates himself does use medical metaphors in this dialogue. He says, for example, that the misologist must have a bad health, that philosophy is an art of purification, a way of building oneself up so that one can resist these misological tendencies. And there are probably various moral and epistemic pathologies that he could appeal to in order to explain why people fall for misology. So you might mention prejudices, certain confusions, dreadful ignorance about the nature of argumentation, certain kinds of moral and epistemic vices as well. So when Schindler talks about misology, he says it really reflects the vice of intellectual impatience, people who just can't wait to get to the end of an argument, and so they sort of skip ahead to the end. They don't go through the process of argumentation. Miller mentions certain kinds of cowardice, where a misological person is not courageous enough to commit themselves to the deliverances of reason. They won't follow reason wherever it goes. Instead, in a very cowardly way, they try to protect certain core beliefs. And other critics of misology mention lack of self-control, lack of self-restraint, dogmatism, pride, hubris. But whatever one prefers, the claim is that there is something wrong with a person who becomes misological. As Callanan rather nicely puts it, what's wrong with the misologist for Socrates is that they confuse an operator error with a system error. The misologist thinks that there is something wrong with reason itself, when in fact, what's wrong is them. They have an excessive conception of reason. They have wrong views about what reason can do. But the fault, he says, lies not in reason, but in the individual reasoner. And again, in the dialogue, Socrates doesn't really identify what the defects of the misologue are. But going through his discussion, we can identify various defects that might be a feature of the misologist, defects that increase your susceptibility to misology. So maybe you might say that the misologue fails to trust well. They just haven't acquired the art of trusting. They don't know how to choose how to trust, or who to trust, or when to trust. Maybe they fail to notify and rectify insufficiencies in their art. They don't recognize that they're bad at trusting. They're trusting in an ignorant, confused way. Or maybe they can't identify and detect false beliefs about reason and argumentation. They've got reason and argumentation wrong, but they don't know this. They don't understand. Maybe they haven't read enough of the recent articles in informal logic or argumentation. They don't really know what they're talking about. They're naive and ignorant. Or they haven't detected and corrected their excessive expectations. So they're expecting too much of reason, but the sad thing is they don't even know. Or maybe they're very bad at epistemic emotional self-regulation. When they experience confusion, uncertainty, and disorientation, they can't cope with this. They panic and they flail. And a tough-minded critic says, look, confusion and disorientation is really par for the course when it comes to the life of the mind. And if you can't cope with these negative epistemic experiences, well, you need to toughen up and you need to learn ways to manage these epistemic anxieties. Or it might be that they have various vices that they've failed to overcome. I mean, one common claim in the literature is that the misologist is guilty of a kind of pride or hubris. The misologist would rather say reason itself is weak and corrupt rather than admit that they were wrong. So rather than, honestly owning up to their own faults, they would rather condemn reason and turn their back on it, which does seem to be central to Socrates' worries. So for Socrates, then, the etiology of misology will always be pathological. If people become misological, it reflects something wrong with them as a person, morally or epistemically. They're not in good health. They're not strong. They're not reflective. They don't have courage or patience. They do not have the virtues of mind that would guard them against this. And again, I think that might be true of some misologues in at least some cases. I'm sure there are people who are guilty of the kind of pathology that Socrates is describing. The problem is, it just can't be the whole story, and it won't be the story in every case. I think there are lots of reasons that a person might become misological, but the explanation for the how and the why won't just involve their individual level defects. In a sense, what we need is for explanations of misological conversion to be more multidimensional. So this is a term that Kasim Kassam uses in his work on vice epistemology. So Kasim says, we're interested in epistemic failures. Why do people fail epistemically? And he says the reasons will be complicated, and so we should be pluralistic or multidimensional. Why do people fail? Well, it might be due to psychological biases, confusions, epistemic vices, bad interpersonal dynamics. It might be situational factors. It might be social and structural constraints. But he says there will be no easy single factor story about why people epistemically fail. And what I think the same point here is going to be true of misology. Why do people become misological? Well, there's no single factor explanation. It may be due to individual level failings and defects, but not in every case, and we should tell a more complicated story. So think about this misological phenomenon of having an excessive trust in reason. Now, why might a person have an excessive trust in reason? Well, it might be due to personal failings. Maybe the person is rash, or they're prone to inflated views of things. Maybe they lack epistemic self-control. They're not reflective. It might be something wrong with them at the individual level, but it could also be the bad influence of other people. Maybe lots of their epistemic peers keep parroting exaggerated conceptions of reason. Maybe their friends don't recognize that they're tending towards excess and hold them in check and bring them back. Maybe they have bad interpersonal relations with other people. Maybe they exist in problematic social and environmental conditions. So when there's a discussion of misology in the Republic, but there the view is much softer. The claim there is when people become misological, it must be due to defects in their education and training. If people are misological, it's because their educational systems have, well, crudely, misinformed them about the nature and scope of reasons. So that's a very non-pathological explanation. So there could be social environmental conditions that encourage certain kinds of misology. I mean, that is Schindler's claim. I mean, he claims very largely that late modern societies are infested with misological habits, which infuse into our ways of thinking at a very general level. Or you could be like fully multidimensional and say, well, look, why do people become misological? It's going to be a combination of individual, interpersonal, social, and structural conditions, probably quite a lot of bad epistemic luck as well, not to mention other suboptimal features of the social world. Entrenched systems of unfairness, the distracting and overwhelming character of everyday life, background patriarchal structures that distort our understanding of reasoning, the sheer busyness of life, the fact that many people might be invested in misology because if you can get people to abandon their confidence in reason, it's going to be much easier to push them around. But you tell a very multidimensional story. And I think this is the sort of story that we should tell about misology. The etiology of it is going to be complicated, but it will be significantly interpersonal and social. And these multidimensional stories might include individual failings and defects, but it will also include people's experiences of argumentation, encounters with virtuous and vicious adversarialists, the complexities of social and emotional life, background social pressures, temptations, and inducements, a pragmatic understanding of the costs and rewards of committing oneself robustly to reason, and also maybe the general character of cultures of argumentation. There are lots of factors that would have to be factored in order to explain how and why people become misological and why their processes of misological conversion take the courses that they do. So misological experience then are going to be much more complex than Socrates suggests. They're going to be complex, they're going to be very contingent on a whole range of factors and very mutable, but they will have uncertain outcomes. And it might be the case then that there are ways that we could intervene when people are succumbing to misology in order to either steer them away from it and then bring them back into sort of trust in reason, or at least to ensure that the kinds of misology they end up in aren't the hateful, dogmatic, deeply distrustful sorts from which there might be no rescue, but instead there might be gentler and more moderate kinds of misology that we might help the person to find their way into. Because Socrates does say, very briefly, that not all misology is a bad thing. He does seem to suggest that a little tincture of misology can be a good antidote to certain kinds of dogmatism or hyper-rationalism. And it suggested that misology might be a component in certain kinds of skepticism. Just a little drop of misology could be very good for the epistemic body, as it were. But the point then with that is that misology is much more complicated. And if we only see it in terms of individual level defects, we're really underestimating just how complex a phenomena is going to be. So those are two worries with the standard model. I think Socrates is describing an interesting phenomena. I think misology is a real thing, but I think it takes many more forms than he realizes. And not all of these forms can be explained purely in terms of individual level defects. So what we want then is, I think, a much more expansive account. And this is section 5 on the handout, and it's the last section. So we want a much more complex and interpersonally sophisticated account of the many ways that you can become and be misological. What we probably want as well is a taxonomy of different kinds of misology. I think there are probably different species of misology in the same way that I think there are different kinds of misanthrope. I don't have that taxonomy for you, and I don't have an expansive account of misology here for you. It's only worth doing that kind of work if you think that misology is a useful concept. So if your collective answer is no, it's not, then I'll just pack up shop here. But I do have 6 suggestions for what I think an expansive account of misology should at least incorporate. And I'll present these tentatively because I'm genuinely not sure. But here are things that an expansive account maybe should honor. The first is that trust in reason and argumentation is not going to be a unitary achievement. It's going to be very complex and it's going to be very dynamic. There'll be a complex structure of different kinds of trust, some of them with specific content, some of them with more general content, some of them interpersonal and some of them not, some of them very much in the background, others much more in the foreground of our epistemic life. So trust in reason is going to be a complex, dynamic thing, something which can be initiated, developed, sustained, enhanced, undermined, challenged, and reconfigured. And I think that will be part of a person's epistemic life. Second, these sorts of pre-misological anxieties and uncertainties are going to take different forms depending upon your interpersonal relations. So suppose you have these anxieties, like the one described in the Phaedo. Suddenly they have this unpleasant feeling. They're uncertain. They say it's almost like I'm drunk and I'm swaying. I'm disorientated and I can't find my way around. It feels like reason has just evaporated. Now, if you have those anxieties, it's going to depend a lot upon your interpersonal world. I mean, if these anxieties are initiated, the ways that they might be modulated and changed by your interactions with other people, the ways that these anxieties could be initiated and almost egged on or encouraged by other people, or the ways that other people could try to diffuse these anxieties, to soothe and console you, all this will depend upon the particularities of your interpersonal life. And it will crucially depend then both on, well, as it were, who's around you, and also how much care do they have for your epistemic well-being. I mean, if the people around you are all cruel, vicious, and epistemically malevolent, and they see you anxious and disorientated, they're probably going to take advantage of that, and that's terrible bad luck. Whereas if the people around you are more reassuring, more epistemically hospitable, they might try to help you cope with these anxieties and might be able to diffuse them. For example, maybe there is a kind of argumentative role where you recognize that your interlocutor suddenly is in this uncomfortable state of disorientation, distress, and your role then becomes a more benevolent or beneficent one, where you're trying to support and reassure them. I have to do this with my PhD students and indeed my undergraduate students. You recognize a kind of epistemic distress that needs to be resolved, a crisis of confidence when the PhD student comes in because they've had their first journal rejection and they're anxious and worried and they want to give up on philosophy. In that case, your role is reassurance and support. Third claim is that when people have these misological anxieties, it shouldn't just be understood in terms of a certain set of emotions and feelings. Rather, those anxieties are responses to disruptions in these structures of trust and argumentation. So the anxieties are actually, in a sense, quite deep-rooted. And what's happening is that the person is experiencing a disturbance to a background structure of trusts, maybe a structure they hadn't fully realized was in place. But because that structure of trust has been destabilized, they're now experiencing certain kinds of anxiety and disorientation. The whole framework for their epistemic orientation is now shifting or breaking in ways that can be quite alarming. And I think when you have disruptions to your trust in the world, it's also going to have disruptions to the kind of hopes that you can experience. Because I think hope and trust are very intimately related. Our ability to sustain certain kinds of hope partly depends upon the kinds of trust that we have. For example, I'm hoping that the discussion after this talk is going to be collegial, productive, constructive, fair-minded. Maybe there's going to be a few good jokes as well. There'll be a nice atmosphere. Now, that's a series of hopes that I have. But those hopes are all sustained by certain kinds of trust. I trust that you're all decent, fair-minded, nice people. I trust that none of you are jerks. I trust that if anyone was becoming mean and aggressive and brutal, that the chair would step in. I trust that we're all here because we have a commitment to a sense of collective inquiry, where the aim of a discussion after a talk is not to knock down the speaker, but to build up the argument. So there's a complex interplay of hopes and trusts at work in this kind of context. But when trust gets disrupted, so do our hopes. And when you experience disrupted hopes and trusts, that's going to intensify certain feelings of disorientation. Fourth, then, any account of misology is going to have to be sensitive to just how messy these disruptions of trust are. This is why misologists report these experiences of disorientation, doubt, and uncertainty. But it's not just a kind of cool propositional uncertainty, like I do not know what is the correct answer. I do not know which argument is the best. It's not that. It's a much deeper kind of disorientation where a person no longer knows how to comport themselves epistemically. They don't know which way to go. There is an anxiety about their very capacity to function as an epistemic agent. And when this becomes really, really, really acute, it'll indicate that misology is actually quite a horrible experience. A fifth claim related to this is that I think misological attitudes and emotions and like disorientation and frustration, these are going to be much more likely if you have the bad luck to be surrounded by epistemically vicious people. So if you have these anxieties and worries and this lack of trust in reason, well, that's going to be activated and intensified and hardened if the people around you are epistemically vicious, if they're aggressive, dominative, dogmatic, if they're not sensitive to other people's epistemic needs and vulnerabilities. In these kinds of cases, you're going to have a much worse time if you're in a misological crisis, because the people around you are either disposed not to help you or to exploit your epistemic disorientation for their own ends. In fact, there might be a certain kind of epistemic malevolence that will involve trying to force people into a misological state and then to exploit that state if it actually comes about. I mean, the classic example here, which is always discussed in the feminist literature, is the famous example that Simone de Beauvoir gives of an early discussion with Sartre. And de Beauvoir recalls in her diaries that she kind of presented a sort of a plural theory of ethics to Sartre. And over the course of a couple of hours, Sartre just tore it apart, absolutely shredded it. But de Beauvoir said, but by the end of his annihilation, she says, I didn't just not know what I thought anymore. I didn't even know if I could think at all. I've been subject to such a destructive epistemic experience. My entire epistemic self-trust had just been desolated. And I walked out of there not just having abandoned my theory, but having abandoned, at least for a time, any ambition to ever theorize again. Of course, fortunately, she overcomes this. So misological attitudes and feelings are going to be much more likely and much more painful in the presence of vicious interlocutors. And a final thing that I think should be in an expansive account of misology is the idea that misological attitudes and orientations will be much more intelligible to people and much more attractive in certain kinds of hostile epistemic and cultural environments. I take it one problem with the reason is that the attractions and the value of reason is going to be heavily contingent on the kind of society that you're in. If you live within a very epistemically well-conducted society with high intellectual standards and a respect for scholarship, well-supported cultures of education, where everyone reads popular philosophy at the weekend and there's a common commitment to the highest epistemic ideals, in that sort of society, reason is going to be intelligible, compelling, and attractive. Unfortunately, there aren't very many of those kinds of environments on planet Earth. I think a lot of good work in feminist, social, political epistemology has shown that very many social and political environments of the kind we're familiar with are agonistic, distrustful, epistemically vicious, and also epistemically corrupting in the sense of being conducive to vices. I think many social and epistemic environments these days encourage, reward, incentivize the development and the exercise of vices, and make unattractive the cultivation and exercise of various virtues. In an epistemically hostile world like this, misological tendencies might be much more attractive, especially if there are costs, penalties, and punishments for trying to reinforce a commitment to reason. So misology might become much more attractive in certain kinds of hostile epistemic environments. And again, I see something like this in a lot of the modern work on polarization, fanaticism, and extremism. In certain kinds of social and political contexts, misology will be much more compelling. In fact, it might come to seem a sensible way to conduct oneself epistemically. So these would just be some of the features that I think should be in an expansive account of misology. And if we wanted to develop this, then we'd have to look at work in social, feminist, political, and character epistemology, the work on epistemic emotions, argumentation theory, of course, the work on hope and trust. There'll be a lot of social psychology here as well. This would have to be a multidisciplinary project to try to understand varieties of modern misology. And I think if we did that work, we'd also end up relating misology to another pair of concepts, which is pessimism and misanthropy. Because having read an awful lot of pessimism and misanthropy lately, it seems to me that misology is actually there in the background of many complaints of many pessimists and many misanthropes. I mean, when pessimists and misanthropes issue these negative appraisals of our existential, moral, and epistemic condition, I think misology is there in the background. I think it's a useful concept for those kinds of discourses. I mean, I suppose one way to put this is misology is not simply going to be a problem that afflicts small groups of inquirers here and there. I think it's a perennial human vulnerability, and one that unfortunately tends to be drawn out and incentivized by the kinds of societies that unfortunately we find ourselves living in. So the question, whatever happened to misanthropy, is partly the question is, why aren't more people recognizing the misological character of the kind of world that we inhabit? Or at least that's a sort of large claim that we might end up with. And on that rather gloomy note, I'll finish here and I'll thank you all for listening. Thank you.